Revolutionary greetings, comrades. We meet once again in our political education. It's a red Sunday, the 15th of December, 2024. Workers have already, men of the workers have already taken leave. They are joining their families. In some earlier video we said, we did say that without the bourgeoisie, I'm saying without the bourgeoisie, let me put it in this way, the bourgeoisie, and to explain that the bourgeoisie are those that own the productive forces, created the proletariat. Ngamanye amagama, abaqhashi yibo abenza kwaba labasebenzi. Without abaqhashi bangasoze kube labasebenzi. And we have said that workers can now produce without the supervision of abaqhashi. So every December, then workers are given time off. Workers are given time off, take a leave to be with their families. As capitalism and colonialism was developing in this part of the world, people were moved, which we'll look into in our program later on. People were moved from reserves, what is called the reserves or rural communities. Today, Situksemakaya rural communities, to work in industries, to work in the mines, to work in factories, on farms, separated from their own families. The reserves or rural communities became indawo of raising the new labor force. Kwakusele abadala emakhaya, abadala bekhulisa abantwana abancane, who will then later on replace their own fathers at the workplace. Now, because of the changing economy in the world, we find that many migrants work or many workers work outside their countries of origin, known as migrant labor. This is why, if you check today at the Bedbridge border post, you will see a long queue because workers are returning to be with their families. Some leave their wives at home, only see them once a year. So that's the nature of capitalism. So we're looking into this in our political education today, communism and the Pan-Africanism. So I was just trying to lay for the purposes of this discussion. It's important that we talk about the communism and Pan-Africanism so that we understand our struggle in Zimbabwe. There are many people who would say the liberation movements were socialist in nature, and they want to dispel this notion. In our political and economic program, Completing the Liberation of Zimbabwe, we say, I quote, "The victory over fascism in the Second World War of 1939 to 1945, mainly through the efforts of the Soviet Union and its Red Army, but assisted by communist-led resistance movements in many other countries, led to the establishment of socialist countries in Eastern Europe and in China, Korea, and Vietnam. Colonial possessions in Asia, India, Pakistan, Burma, Indonesia also gained independence from direct colonial rule. These victories had a profound influence on those fighting for the rights of Africans and also of those of African descent in the Americas, that is North and South America and the Caribbean." So the liberation movement, when they were established, particularly they were established before the First World War. For instance, the ANC gets formed in 1912, right? But the liberation movement post the fascist war, what we call the Second World War, were largely influenced by Soviet Union and the other socialist bloc countries. This is why in Rhodesia, the armed wing of ZIPRA was trained by Soviet Union and the other socialist countries. The armed wing of ZANU, ZANDA, was trained by China and the other socialist countries. So they had a huge influence in the liberation armies and in the liberation movement. But this did not in any way mean that the liberation movements themselves were socialist in nature. And this is what we argue in our program. Because uzezwa abantu besithi no, ZANU-PF, when it came to power in 1980, it was socialist in character. Abantu bethi thina kasiyifuni i-socialism, kasiyifuni Zimbabwe Communist Party because ikhuluma nge-socialism. It is going to take us back to ama-failures of ZANU-PF and also take back to a dictatorship of the political leadership. This is the criticism that we get from the people that we engage. Now, the liberation movement, because they were fighting against colonialism, not necessarily against imperialism. We must make a distinction. Because in the earlier years of the liberation struggle, the liberation movements were fighting for the right to vote, equality, not to necessarily transform a society. They were fighting, we are also citizens. We must have a right to participate in the decision making. There were petitions that were presented to the Queen of England at that time. Now, because they did not succeed in persuading the colonial powers to grant them their wish, and after the Second World War, liberation movements then had to seek assistance from Soviet Union and the other socialist bloc countries. Now, in seeking assistance, they then mastered the slogans, socialist slogans. They mastered the songs, composed the songs that were talking about socialism. I remember in 1979, 1980, early 1980, as we were preparing for the first elections in 1980, we used to sing in my village, ingoma ethi yini i-socialism, umhlaba wonke ezandleni zabantu. Because in 1978, ZAPU had said in ideology is Marxist-Leninist. If you study other liberation movements, you'll understand that they tend to proclaim that they are biased to the left, and that they are rooted in Marxist-Leninist theory, scientific socialism, which we have discussed before. But in outlook, they were not socialist. This is why we argue in the Zimbabwean context that ZANU-PF was never socialist. To understand why we are saying they were not socialist, because Soviet Union and the other socialist countries not only provided military training, they armed the guerrillas. We always say that Zipra, Zanla, MK, Apla, they were all armed in most of the cases by communists. Because the socialist countries were led by communist parties in the main. So they were armed, trained by communists. And the communists provided practical support, even in finance. And it took some to undergo political education, ideological training. But this did not in any way make them a socialist, or they were not communists. They were only interested ukuthi babe assisted to dismantle colonialism. Angithi thina eselusayo njoba kwesikhathi sezulu I was following some discussion ukuthi there's going to be some floods, there's a cyclone esuka from Mozambique ezongena eZimbabwe and so forth. I can't remember the name of that cyclone. Thina esakhula selus sasisithi nxa ungagcwalelwa ngumfula uqhuba inkomo, umfana wenkomo, uyakwazi ukuthi normally vele inkomo angeke uyibambe umsila ngoba yakukhahlela. But mawumfula usugcwalelwa umfula ungaphetshe ufunkalala ngekhaya, uyachayela inkomo emanzini emfuleni, mayingena emanzini la ubambe umsila until you cross. Immediately ufika ngale uweqele eceleni ngoba izokukhahlela. So the liberation movements used this concept. Beyokuthi thina we just want to be across the river. Sifuna ukudefeata colonialism. What then happens thereafter was not an issue for liberation movements, as long as they were in power. This is why Kwame Nkrumah speaks about a neo-colonial state. Post-liberation, why in our program we argue that liberation movements were not socialist in nature. Yes, they were influenced, armed, trained their guerrilla armies by communists, but they were not communists. Post-liberation, they then adopted neoliberal policies. They did not build economy along socialist lines. We have defined that in neoliberalism says, in neo-colonial state, says, yes, as we discussed previously, you can have majority rule. You can have your black parliamentarians, presidents, prime ministers, ministers, and so forth. But the economy remains in the hands of colonizers. Whereas post Second World War, post the Fascist War, socialist economies emerged in the countries that I listed because they understood, communists understood, that you needed to transform the state, not to reform it. There's a huge difference. And the election by its very nature, a bourgeoisie election by its very nature, it's about reforming the state. We'll be announcing in February the date of the Second Congress of the Zimbabwe Communist Party, which is going to happen in 2025. Already in the discussions that we are having as a party, The discussion is, which comrades are raising inside the party, is what is the attitude of the Zimbabwe Communist Party to the question of elections? Can a communist party in Zimbabwe contest an election? And what is the objective of contesting an election? What does it seek to achieve by contesting an election? This is the discussion that is currently happening inside the Zimbabwe Communist Party. And in the discussion, we also make this point that a communist party, which we'll discuss later, of course, I know Sengani Nyasuka kakhulu, a communist party is not a class by itself. It is a vanguard of the working class and peasant, and it must lead these classes to victory. And what is this victory? Is dictatorship of the proletariat. And the questions that we are discussing, or which we are confronted with, which we are discussing inside the Zimbabwe Communist Party, is will electoral participation lead to the dictatorship of the proletariat? We are also drawing lessons from what has been happening in the Congress of the South African Communist Party, Special Congress, where it resolves that it will contest local government elections. We are drawing lessons. But as I move to conclusion, which will continue to discuss this question, communism and Pan-Africanism, is that what we want to address firstly is that liberation movements were not socialist in character. Liberation movements got support from communists to establish majority rule. Because it will not be scientific for me to say to dismantle colonialism. Because colonialism was not dismantled. If colonialism was dismantled, we would not be having a neo-colonial state. So it would be safe in scientific terms to say liberation movements wanted political majority rule. They understood that they can only be supported to achieve this goal by seeking assistance from communist parties. Let me just read the next two paragraphs. They are not the last, because we'll discuss the others in the next video, so that you have an understanding on what you are raising in our program. In late October 1945, only 2 months after the Allied victory in Japan and 5 months after the entry of the Red Army into Berlin, the German capital, the 5th Pan-African Congress was held in Manchester, England. That conference marked a turning point in the direction of the Pan-African movement. The fight for the recognition of the humanity of Africans and those of African descent grew into the struggle for the creation of an independent state in Africa and the Caribbean. I want us to underline the word recognition. Let me repeat that line. The fight for the recognition, right, of the humanity of Africans and those of African descent grew into the struggle for the creation of independent states in Africa and the Caribbean. My last paragraph. The first Pan-African Conference had been held at Westminster Hall in London in 1900. It was organized by Trinidadian lawyer Henry Sylvester Williams. It was a polite affair which included tea with the Bishop of London at his residence. There was, however, a petition to Queen Victoria concerning the conditions of Africans in South Africa and in Rhodesia. Right. There were petitions to the Queen. Babe siyacela. Phela petition ukuyacela. Babe siyacela ukuthi can you be free? Because the ANC, when it was formed in 1912, before it was later on radicalized, yayigijima ngama petitions. When I raised in our own context, umthwakazi indaba yama petitions, some comrades were saying that umabheno sesithini esesithi thina sigijimisa ama petitions. This is what, before the radicalization of liberation movement by communists, they were sending petitions. And they realized that petitions were not the answer. As I was saying, talking about the restoration agenda, I'm not a restorationist myself. I share the view which says we must advance a reunion agenda. And we said the reunion agenda, we defined it that we must do away with these colonial borders within the SADC region towards the building of one Africa. But we'll discuss that some other time. So, earlier, the liberation movements were more concerned about petitions. They were not radicalized. And I'm saying when I raised this in the context of the restoration movement in Zimbabwe, that it is about petitions. And it finds itself where the liberation movement, before they were radicalized by communists, find themselves in. So the liberation movement then get support, and they began to understand the unity of African people. African people, not only in the African continent, but global, in the Caribbean, in North and South America. They understood that the Africans were victims of colonialism, and that it was critical to establish, build unity amongst the Africans and the fight for the rights. So, and here it says for the recognition of Africans. The liberation movements understood. This is why alliances were forged. The Organization of African Unity, which we'll talk about later on, gets established in 1963 as a tool to mobilize the African people to build unity. This is why within the OAU there was a liberation committee which was focusing on the liberation of Africa. But we define this liberation, which we have spoken about in Zimbabwe, spoken about in South Africa, and spoken about all over, that this liberation was about majority rule. It was not about transformation of society. It was not about dismantling colonialism, because it led, the majority rule led to a neo-colonial state, which in our program we argue that we need to dismantle a neo-colonial state if we are to complete our liberation as the people of Zimbabwe. I'm concluding now. And we are discussing inside the Zimbabwe Communist Party that will contesting elections in Zimbabwe lead to the dismantlement of a neo-colonial state. because we understand an election as a reformist agenda. Political parties that enter elections, we can use Zambia as a case study. When UNIP was removed through an election in 1991, Chuluba took over. There have been change of governments. We can use Malawi as a case study again when Banda was removed in 1994. The state is being reformed. Over the years it has been reformed. It has not been transformed. And what does this mean to communists? As we're discussing inside the Zimbabwe Communist Party. And Lenin says communists should not boycott bourgeoisie elections. And he says, when you go to parliament, go and dismantle it, because it is an institution that does not represent the interests of the working class and the peasantry. It is a bourgeoisie parliament. The instruction from Comrade Lenin is that when communists go to parliament, they must go there with one purpose: to dismantle the bourgeoisie tool, which is responsible for adopting laws that oppress the working class and the peasantry. Please write your comments, comrades. Let's continue to engage on these critical matters. Please like this video if you are following us on YouTube. I know here we're on Facebook, but if you are on YouTube, like the video. If you are on TikTok, please do follow us so that we continue to engage. Otherwise, Amandla, comrades.